Welcome to the Semi-Retired Podcast with your host, Dave Farranth.
And me, Richard Bonomo.
Richard, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. You?
Not bad. 2023 is off to a great start.
Can you believe we're already at episode 25?
You know, I can't, Richard. It feels like only yesterday that we started with episode 1. And in fact, I looked this up, and our episode 1 published just days before ex-President Trump was raided at Mar-a-Lago by the FBI. Our podcast dates from that same week.
Is there a correlation there?
Well, I'm not sure yet, but I think it's worth looking into.
Scientists in the future will link the two on a timeline.
It's got to be more than a coincidence. And just so the folks out there know, Richard and I are planning a special party. Keep your eyes peeled to our social media and YouTube channel for an update on that.
I just got a message, caterers on their way. So Dave, today, what are we doing?
We're talking about the impact that digital technology has had on our lives. We're of the perfect age where we kind of started off life in an analog pre-digital sense. But then digital technology came along and swept through our lives in various ways, and we're both quite technically oriented. You more so than I am when it comes to the actual workings of computers, but neither of us ever shrunk from digital. We went there. Richard, do you want to get the discussion underway?
Yeah, so if we go back early days, think of our toys. Our toys were very mechanical.
Absolutely.
You were lucky if it had a little motor that ran on a giant battery and lasted about 10 seconds before you had to change batteries.
Remember those little tiny motors that were in everything?
Yeah. I think some of the Meccano sets might have had little
yes,
motors
they did.
too.
That's right.
In comparison to today's toys, where everything is electronic, everything is based off a microchip, the evolution came rather quickly for us. Like, we grew up early 60s, but our heyday was probably going to be like the 70s and early 80s as the formative years, where a lot of that change took place. The transition from LPs to CDs. That was a huge transition for us. Yeah. You'd walk into a store and it'd have like music playing, and the CD would play, and all of a sudden you hear that as the CD would skip, and you'd have to go up to the clerk and say, your CD's skipping.
Do you have any specific memories back in the 70s? Because that's when we were kind of getting into our tweens and teens and all that, of encountering digital technology for the first time. I do, but I'll see if you got something.
I'll let you go first.
What I'm about to describe appears on the graphic for this episode. It's a digital game called Pong. P-O-N-G, the second half of ping pong. We encountered this where I grew up in a Zeller's store where a Pong system was set up in the TV department, and you could stand there and play. So us 11, 12, 13-year-olds would go over there and just stand there and play Pong. And it was like playing tennis. You had a paddle and you just scrolled it up and down, and you could bounce the ball, and you had a limited amount of control. You could make the ball bounce very steep or very shallow. That was Pong. Did we attribute any significance to it at the time? Absolutely not. It was just a game. That's my first. But what I do also remember is on the block where I grew up, one of the fathers one day was talking to us outside. I don't know why, was talking about what he did, and he mentioned bits and bytes. Never heard of them. The conversation didn't cause me to make any decisions about my life. But I remember him saying the data in computers was made up of bits and bytes, and that's how it was measured. This stuck in my head.
So just to go back to your Pong, for me, we had a Pong console. I'm not sure now. I looked up Pong, and I'm not quite sure the one I had was an actual Pong, but it was probably a knockoff. What I remember is sort of like a cylinder with a rotating top that you held in your hand. The console itself had a switch that allowed you to play, I think it was 1-player, 2-player.
Makes
and then
sense.
there was another switch with the 4 different games.
Right.
You had tennis, hockey.
Yours is a more advanced Pong than the one I recall was just the tennis. So, just a court and a paddle at each end. Yes, you could play against the computer, obviously.
Yeah. And you could also play 2 players. So if you played, I forget if it was called hockey or soccer, your controller would control 2 players, but at the same time. So they both moved up and down. When the cube came off the wall, if you spun your paddle and shot, you could give it some English, as
they say.
That's right,
some English. That's right. Speaking of, when you say, can we get back to your Pong? In English, that means your bad bodily odor. If you say you have a really terrible Pong today, it means you stink. So just saying, I let that go because this is Canada. So speaking of body English, there you go.
I knew of the hum, but I never heard of a Pong, a bad Pong. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so you could make the ball do
that's right.
some slightly
or
more,
you thought you could, right?
Maybe it was all
in
your head,
in the mind's eye. Yeah,
in the mind's eye.
But it was fun, right?
It was a blast, and I think I got that. I must have been around 21, 22 or something. And I remember my mom bringing this thing down. I don't know where she got it. It was from a neighbor or whatever, and plugging it in with my friends and going, "Oh my god, I think this is Pong." Obviously, you had to hook that up to a CRT, and I don't remember if it had RCA connectors on the back or if it had those little 2 wires that you plugged into the antenna screws on the back of your TV. Old TVs had a way to connect.
This is where you're more technically adept than I am, because I was never really clear about what the different connectors were called. I recognize them. I think I know what an RCA adapter is. But you said 2122.
I think so.
And when would you have been 2122?
About that many years after I was born.
2122 years after I was born.
Mid-80s.
Because my memories of Pong are dating back to, say, 1973, 74. So,
well, you were avant-garde.
Or the Zeller store in St. Eustache, Quebec, Canada was avant-garde. And then the next game I remember was really all about games. That goes all the way forward to Pac-Man. The great Pac-Man craze of what, early 80s or something? I was a big pinball fanatic, and electronics invaded the pinball arcades. I remember starting off with the old mechanical pinball machines. It was all about, well, it was lights and buzzers and that, but then they became electronic. That was the first inklings of digital technology in my life.
That would be for me too. I remember the arcades at the time, you had to be 16 to go into the arcade. So Pac-Man came out in 1980. So before that, we would hit the arcades and I would always get carded. I had to try to hide whenever we went to these places because they would card you at 16 and kick you out. And I remember the day I turned 16, I was so proud. I had my Medicare card, said I'm turning 16, walked into the place. They never carded me after that. They never asked me. It's like they knew on my face that I was old enough. Either that or they got tired.
See, that's wrong. You should have had the pleasure of going, not anymore.
Yeah.
And showing your card,
That's
right?
what I wanted to do. I was like, I was all ready, here's my ID.
Yeah, back off, buddy.
Yeah, and I know like you weren't supposed to play the games or whatever. I wasn't playing. I just wanted to watch what my friends were playing because I had a few friends who were really into pinball, right? Pinball, the arcades back then were all pin. And then slowly these little tables arrived with Pac-Man. And then you would sit down and play Pac-Man at that weird table,
That's
right?
exactly right, yeah.
Pac-Man, then you had Centipede and
Space Invaders.
Space Invaders, yes. Space Invaders was huge back then. But I remember the guys, I remember some friends specifically playing pinball, and it was quite an art to play. And there was the whole thing of like
the body English.
The body English.
Again.
You could knock it a certain way. You had to be careful because there was gyroscopes inside and you could tilt the machine.
You could tilt the machine, that's right.
Which was pretty wild. And knowing exactly which directions. I think you could push it backwards and forwards, but side to side or a tip. And you knew each machine had a slightly different gyroscope in it, so they knew how to slam. And it was like watching a guy screw a machine.
Yeah,
sometimes.
pretty much it was,
From the back, you're not sure what's going on.
You had to learn it. And it was a bit like, say, the YouTube algorithm. You were never sure, right? When it was going to pop into effect. So, digital crept into the arcades, crept into our gaming life, such as it was at the time.
Now, Pac-Man came out, and then for some reason, Pac-Man disappeared, and all we had was Miss Pac-Man. Did she get the game industry in the divorce?
That's a very good question.
I'm not sure.
That's a very good question.
After a while, you couldn't see Pac-Man anymore, and it was just Miss Pac-Man.
I wonder why that was.
And I wonder if there was some sort of like copyright thing or something, and they pulled it off the market, competitor.
Yeah, there's got to be a story there. The other one I played at the time, which really was just Pac-Man wearing different clothing, was called Lock and Chase.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned this,
Slightly different game setup. I think this was played on a vertical console, not at a table, but same basic idea. I never got into the Space Invaders or the others. Really, I was a Pac-Man man and a Lock and Chase man. And then that kind of faded away, quite frankly.
And then I guess people started getting game consoles, the Ataris, the Segas, the stuff.
Yeah, and I never had one. Never had that.
Never
had that. My parents weren't there. I didn't have one. I don't want to jump too far forward, but for me, that came later with the Super Nintendo. But that's far in the future. We're still dabbling around, the late 70s, early 80s?
And so at that point, I was working in a pharmacy, drugstore for everyone else, in a big shopping mall out in the East End here. And in the mall itself, you had your stores. I worked in the pharmacy and I was across from the food court. Yep. And in the mall, there would be little kiosks like you have in most shopping centers today. And one of them sold computers. And so this would be 1980, 82 or whatever. And it was like I started getting interested in computers, was buying magazines, and they had a kiosk there selling computers, and they were selling Colecos. I don't know if you remember Coleco.
I remember the brand, but I associate it with games. But you're saying it's actually, you could get a computer?
Coleco came out with a computer called the Atom. Coleco Atom, which I lusted for.
No memory of that.
And it was like $800 at the time when that was like, 6 months pay for me. Or something. And I remember it was a computer, but it was basically a game console thinly disguised as a computer. And it came with paddles. He had these weird paddles that had like a keypad on it, like a numeric keypad, and a little turny thing on top, like a little thing, a joystick. and stuff. And they had, I think they had Commodores in there. You would have had your Commodore 64s and
See,
different
that I heard
devices.
of.
And that was like my first sort of lusting for computers at the time. And it's lasted till today.
Understandably so. I mean, they're a terrific piece of equipment, let's face it.
Yeah, and dodged a good silicone bullet because the Coleco Atom, I mean, I think bankrupted the company. Nobody bought them. They were underpowered. They were really crap, and it didn't go anywhere.
I was thinking the other day, computers are ubiquitous now. They're in everybody's office. I've had a computer in front of me since 1993, let's say, maybe 1992. I was watching a rerun of the Mary Tyler Moore Show at some point last year. And I'm noticing in the newsroom, Mary and Murray are there. They've got their typewriter in front of them. There's no computer. And that's already, you look at that and go, that's interesting, because they type and they produce a piece of paper. How does that work? Go into Lou's office, and Lou, of course, has nothing on his desk. He doesn't even have the typewriter. And I'd sit there thinking, what was he doing all day long? What could he conceivably have been doing without a computer? Because we were on our computers all the time, producing some sort of document or emailing somebody or booking a meeting or doing something. Lou had a phone and a blotter. It was such a disconnect for me. And I can't remember, because I lived that life a little bit, but not much. And I can't remember what it was like.
They were writing, they were producing stuff, and he was basically running the show. He had no reason to type anything. He would have had, didn't he have a secretary? He would call out
Lou, he must have had, yeah.
He would call out and then take a memo or whatever.
Yeah.
And they would do those things. And they did the thinking and the organizing, I guess.
Yeah. Seems like that'd take, 10, 15 minutes a day? That's the whole problem. I can't
You would think, let's ask a CEO.
That's right. Maybe that's why they're making 243 times what the rest of us are.
So, Dave, the Coleco Atom came out in 83, and I remember the reason I lusted for this, it had twin tape drives.
Twin tape drives.
So in those days, computers had tape drives, like an actual audio cassette that you could store your data on.
So a magnetized ribbon with two reels, whatever sort of thing.
And it used the same thing. It's a cassette tape, same thing you would put in your music player or your stereo, except it recorded the data to it. And this thing came with two tape drives in the front of it. And that was the height of sexiness back then.
I'll bet it was. I have to say that since we're in the early 80s, I attended graphic design school from 1979 to 1982. Not once during that 3-year period did the word computer, or the sense that computers might have an impact on our industry, did that ever come up. I was taught to use felt markers, layout pads, rubber cement, knives, rulers, all kinds of weaponry like that. Not a computer in sight. No sense that, on the horizon might be this huge tidal wave that was going to sweep away everything, not everything we learned, because the design knowledge remained, but the tool set and the context in which we worked was a dead man walking. And you also graphic design school a bit later than me, I think, right?
Yeah, I went in the early 90s.
Okay, so it would have changed for you by then. So I came out of school in 1982. In my first job, I worked for a typesetting house downtown. These don't exist anymore because we do the typesetting with our computers. And the only thing I remember from that period of time, that's 1982 to 1984 probably, is our salesman, Tim, Australian guy, went to Chicago, I believe, and came back with tales of something called MAGIC, the Modular Assembly Graphics Input Coordinator. And he described this large machine to us that an operator would sit at. And what he was really saying was there was a scanner on it. We had no concept of what that meant. First exposure to the concept. So it all sounded very alien to us.
It's like he's telling you that they're going to take an X-ray of the paper almost, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I can recall struggling to understand. MAGIC never materialized at our place. I continued to work with felt pens, layout pads, rulers, rapidographs, rubber cement, tape, stuff like that. As I went through my first couple of jobs. Next was at an advertising agency. What might have been expected to be a bit more modern. I don't even remember the copywriters having computers there. I don't think so. I think they had typewriters. So now we're in 1984, and the storm is yet to hit.
So you had people writing copy on a typewriter.
Correct.
So the typewriter was the closest thing to a mechanical or an automation of handwriting. We had handwriting.
Yes.
Someone would type it up. Somehow it would get typeset, and a book would come out. So I'm a big typewriter fan. I've got books on typewriters. I've owned many typewriters. I love typewriters. If you go back in time, you can see that people were creating art with typewriters, right? There's a whole series of illustrations of like people's faces, all done with typewriters. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. You can go down that rabbit hole and see all this typewriter art, and there would have been books on how to do this. So if you're sitting there with your pen and your felt marker, and you're like, well, how's the typewriter going to do what I do? Yeah, it can type, but it's not as easy. How is it going to go from that to designing an entire page? Try to make a line on a typewriter, right? You can, but it's not a connected line. Yes, there was little places you could put a pen in your typewriter and move the paper, and you could draw straight lines, right? That's how they would do ledger pages.
Do you have a typewriter now?
Yeah, I have two.
Do you use them for anything, or are they just kind of more like a nice objet to have?
A little bit of objet to have for a little while.
That's French, everybody.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. It's an object in Le Havre.
There we go. In Le Havre, France, the port in northern France, of course.
Because everything goes back to France.
That's not it, actually, but okay.
I had 3 or 4 of them in the house, and we each had a typewriter, and we would have little typewriter parties at the house. And me and my wife and my son would take out our typewriters, and we'd type up little stories. And I had these little sheets that I had gotten. They were memos. It was a 3-copy memo. 3-sheet memo, right?
Yeah,
with NCR. So you could, and I would put him in, and I would write to Griffin, blah, blah, blah. We are waiting the report on the blah, blah, blah. And I'd write up this little story, and there'd be a place at the bottom of the sheet for a response. And then I would put it in front of him, and he would take it, and he would roll it into his typewriter, and he would respond back to me. Okay, so and this was like a little game we were playing.
As an aside, I've sometimes worried about my nerdiness level in my life. Not anymore. You've relieved me of that burden.
Or sometimes we'd be downstairs, and I'd say 3 words, I'll write a story. And they would shout out 3 completely different words, and I would cut down little sheets of paper, like half a sheet, or 4x6 or 6x8. And I would say, okay, I'm going to write a story that has to fit on this paper. And I would sit there, tack, 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 and I would write up a story and say, here we go. And I still have them. I saved them. They're in a box somewhere.
Oh, well done. Yeah, you got to keep stuff like that.
I remember growing up, we had a giant cast iron Underwood that belonged to an aunt, but was somehow at our house, a big black typewriter. When you think of an old-fashioned typewriter from the turn of the century or 1930s or so, this big clank, clank, clank with round keys that the paper had all yellowed inside. And I taught myself typing with that.
That's an Underwood?
Yeah, it was an Underwood, yeah.
Okay, because I can see them in my mind's eye, sure.
And at some point, my older brother he had to buy a typewriter for something, and I can't remember what. I think it maybe when he first started working, and he wanted to write up invoices or something. So he went out with my dad, and they bought a Royal Deluxe Quiet, or a Quiet Royal Deluxe. It's a gorgeous gray typewriter with a bit of a, I think they call it a crackle finish to the paint on it.
No, a crackle finish, sure.
Green keys.
Yeah.
Green keys. And it came in this hard case that you would open up. And so that would be down in the basement, and I had the big Underwood, and then I would sneak his typewriter out, and I taught myself to type by copying the grammar book from high school. Voyages in English, it was called. It was a great book.
Very nice.
And I sat there and I just and taught myself to type, which came very handy when I got to high school and every single teacher complained about my handwriting. Now, Dave, you were looking at my notes when we had Kat here, and you commented on my impeccable handwriting.
I shouldn't talk. My handwriting is completely legible. It's interesting because when we were talking about Hunter Thompson, you mentioned, or I mentioned, one of us, that Hunter used to type out the works of his favorite authors just so he could see what it felt like to type those combinations of words. So you were doing something similar.
Yeah, similar, yeah.
You know, not quite, but I mean, in the same ballpark.
Yeah, the great grammar jerks.
The great grammar jerks.
I got to high school, and the teachers I was so fed up of them complaining about my handwriting that I grabbed the typewriter, and in those days everything had to be handed in on loose leaf. And the line spacing on a loose leaf does not equal the line spacing on a typewriter, no matter how you adjust it. It's not quite the same. So every line, you had to push the little button in, turn the handle to get it to line up on the lines, right? Okay. And so I did all my homework in high school, or most of high school, on a typewriter, including lab reports, where I would type up certain things and have to hand draw other parts. And I stopped the complaining, but I taught myself to type. Yet to this day, I can't get past 30 words a minute, which is odd because I used all my fingers
on a typewriter.
Although I learned how to type on a typewriter, and we had like books at home on how to type in, you know, the home rows and how to do this and using all your fingers. Yeah. And I did, but I never got up to the speed because I wasn't really a writer later on. So the typing you do use is, you know, keyboard commands or entering short bursts of text.
Yeah. I got quite quick on the computer keyboard because I did write a lot as part of my career. I seem to have lost it to some extent since the pandemic, because I just don't type as much anymore. But I was very messy. I mean, I would smash the keys, but I was good. I didn't make a lot of mistakes, and I was reasonably quick. But anyways, so let's roll back. So we're in the early 80s. I'm coming out of graphic design school. Digital hasn't really impacted us yet. You like computers. And let's face it, they've been a thing in California since maybe, 1977, 78? When were the first Macs out?
Oh, the Mac came out in 84.
It was 84.
But the Apple I came out 77,
That's
78.
What I'm talking about, the Apple I. I'm mixing them up. Yeah. But I do recall seeing the commercial, the famous commercial for the Macintosh, I guess it was, when they used that scene from 1984.
Yeah, it's
someone throws a hammer through a screen or something.
Yeah. The girl who, we covered this already.
Yes.
The girl who throws the hammer
Do you mean we're running out of content?
The girl who throws the hammer camera through the screen is the same girl who's in the Elton John video,
Oh, that's
Nikita.
right. Nikita, that's right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that commercial aired on the Super Bowl and is what started the craziness of the Super Bowl commercials, and directed by Ridley Scott.
Who had directed Alien. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. I recall that. I recall beginning to hear about the word computer, but I had no sense of what you could do with one. I mean, zero. I mean, it was just a word. I probably interpreted it literally. It computes things. The thought that you could use a computer to write a document or calculate something in a spreadsheet, would have had no idea. In the advertising agency I worked, Vickers and Benson, I'm quite sure that the copywriters were on typewriters. I don't recall seeing any monitors or keyboards anywhere in that place. 1984.
Vickers and Benson, Dave, every time you say it, I still can't believe it's real. It sounds like something like Wallace and Gromit.
They were next door, actually, yeah. That was a proctologist office that I occasionally visited when I had nothing better to do.
Nothing better to do.
Nothing better
Go
to
for
do, yeah.
tune-up.
Hey, exactly. Go for a tune-up. Hey, can you check this? Some strange noises coming out of here. You guys take a
I
look.
lost my watch. Can you see if I left it there?
I got to Avon, big Montreal company here in New York-based company, but Montreal office in 1985. I was an art director. The markers and the layout pads and all that stuff persisted. 1985.
They weren't electric by then?
They weren't electric. Mind you, the copywriters were using a computer. We saw that in their offices. Didn't pay much attention to it, but they were using a machine. There was a monitor. I recall seeing the keyboards. That was the first intrusion of computers into my career, working world, whatever you want to call it.
The 80s come, I'm obsessed with computers, can never really afford one, don't really have a specific reason for one. I'm working at this point, I'm working as a pharmacy clerk, and eventually I decide, after I leave one of my jobs, I decide I want to become a computer programmer. Which it just hit me now. My son is studying computer science, and I wanted to become a programmer at the time because in the 80s, it was the big dream, right? You had all those commercials for Control Data. You remember Control Data Institute?
Yeah, but I wouldn't know what they did. I remember the name.
It was a school that taught you to do programming. So I went and I applied. You had to pass a test. And for some reason, I backed out and didn't end up going there.
Okay.
A few years go by. I decide I'm going to go to college. Never been to college. I didn't go to CJEP with my friends, whatever. I drifted off in another direction. I enlisted in Concordia in a computer programming course and convinced my dad that I need a computer to do this. And so at the time,
nice.
Where did we go? Radio Shack.
Of course, Radio Shack, yes.
Yeah. So my first computer was a Radio Shack. I don't remember the model. It might have been a 286, maybe. I don't know. It had two floppy drives. I had a 5 1/4 and a 3 1/2. It was like fancy. I had both, you know.
Wow.
So this would have been, I think I tried to look it up. It would have been mid 80s. So
okay.
The Mac is out at this point. I was obsessed with the Mac. I had all the magazines. I'd read all the reviews of it as it came out. I followed it.
And what did you think you'd be able to do with it? I'm curious, because that was my big bugaboo. Yeah. If someone said, here's a Mac, what would you have imagined doing with it?
No idea. At the time, it was like seen like, especially the Mac, that when it came out, you know, it was a tiny little box with a 9-inch screen and this mouse. Nothing else really had a mouse at the time. For programming, everything was PC based. So I convinced my dad. I said, listen, I'll do this. I started going to Concordia in computer programming, and one of the classes was accounting. For the life of me, I do not know why we had to learn accounting for computer science. Cut to the chase, did not finish the term, dropped out of that. I just could not wrap my head around the concepts they were trying to teach. We barely even got into the programming. There was a little bit of that, but there was so much other stuff. Like the accounting was killing me trying to learn accounting.
It would have killed me.
Yeah. So I had this Radio Shack computer, and at the time you had a choice between a green monitor, right? The green writing, or orange. And I went for orange because everybody had green, right? Think of your original IBM PC with the green CRT. The writing would have been green. Mine was an orange.
You reminded me that the first computers at Avon had orange type on them. I dumped that little micro memory. You just brought it back. Orange.
Yeah. So that's what I had. And I used it mainly for gaming. I was never a big gamer, but I had a version of a Stealth Fighter. One of the Stealth Fighter games. And the fun part is I had the PC version, and Tandy, which Radio Shack, had an enhanced 16-color graphics card. So it was a 4-color computer, but it could support, through some magic and unicorns, 16 colors. So you would buy a game, and if you had a Radio Shack computer that supported it, you would buy a game and you'd look for on the packaging, Tandy 16. Because then you'd say, oh, when you put it on your IBM PC, you're going to get 4 colors, but on my Radio Shack, I'm going to get 16. So I had this version, and my friend had a Commodore 64, and he had the Commodore 64 version of the same game. And it was like night and day, the graphic capabilities between the two of them.
His was better.
No. Much worse. Much worse. Because I had 16 colors, he had 4. And the graphics also were much cruder on his. And I had this weird little joystick, Dave. It was like a little cube, imagine, with a joystick, a very thin joystick in the middle. If you flip the joystick, it would center back, right? It would back like a joystick does. If you move it to one corner, let go, it centers by flinging back. But this one had a little switch on it, and now the joystick became freeform. So you could move your cursor around on screen, almost working like a mouse. That was fantastic for the stealth fighter, because with the stealth fighter, now you could move it around much more fluidly. And if you let go, it wouldn't jerk back to the middle and crash you as the plane dove as it jumped from the bottom to the center.
Understood.
And so for flying, I would flip it into that. And then for other things, I would flip it into its more controlled mode. That was my foray into computers, the only PC I ever owned.
Because you became a Mac guy after that, right?
That,
That explains why, okay, because I know you're very adept at the inner workings of computers. I understand them a bit conceptually. I've done a bit of tinkering on one of my flight sim computers later in life, but you really know your stuff there, right?
Well, it came to the Mac, especially in the early days when I worked and ended up working at a toy company. I should probably get back to my graphic design school. I went to graphic design school in the mid-90s. It was all Macs, but we still had to learn on paper. So we had to do our layouts, comprehensive layouts, spec out type, draw out your type, stuff like that, and then from that, the exercise was you'd be given a project. And so you'd have to spec it out on the paper, get it approved. You'd go see the teacher, you'd get it approved as if it was the art director kind of thing. You'd get it approved, then you'd come back, and then you were able to go on the computer, which frustrated a lot of people because everybody just wanted to go wacka on the computer and play with mice. I mean, they were there. That's my introduction to graphic design.
So it was Quark, I guess, Quark Express?
Yeah, it would have been Quark.
That's the software, listeners, for producing graphic design work. Page layout specifically, actually.
Yeah, page layout. But that school taught both. It taught Quark and PageMaker, and it taught Illustrator and Freehand. Because at that point, they both had their share of the market.
Yeah, Corel was the other company, right?
Corel. Oh my God, yeah.
PageMaker and Freehand was Corel Draw. Yeah.
No, Corel Draw was Corel. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And PageMaker was Aldus at the time. Aldus PageMaker. Before Adobe ended up buying them. Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing. And Freehand was Aldus Freehand. Yeah. Was it Aldus Freehand?
That sounds right.
They may have had both, yeah.
I probably never touched it, but that just sounds right in my head.
Adobe ended up buying both of them and killing them off. In 1990, I bought a Mac, and it was a Mac Classic. By that point, the Macs had moved away from the small cubes into regular desktop-looking computers. But in 1990, they decided to release the Mac Classic, which was the same shape as the originals. A lot of people derided because it was meant to capture some nostalgia 6 years after the original Mac. They've already changed shapes. But it was my first Mac. My brother was doing graphic design himself as a photographer, had taught himself, had bought a Mac, apparently at my recommendation. I have no memory of this, but he says, I told him people are doing graphic design on this thing called the Macintosh. He ended up buying a Mac SE with an external monitor. And so he had the software. And when I got my Mac, I got copies of the software and taught myself how to use Freehand and Illustrator. So by the time I get to school 4 years later, I'm itching to get on the computer because I'm like, hey, I already know how to use the programs. I've been teaching myself. So I basically got my hands on some copies. Nobody taught me, and I would just, from hacking at it, I taught myself. And so by the time we get there, they're teaching us, I think they started with PageMaker, but I was not used fully to PageMaker. I was a Quark guy because my brother was using Quark, so I was more experienced with Quark, but I had to learn PageMaker first because that's the way they did it. They did PageMaker Quark, and then they did Freehand Illustrator.
That's sounding familiar. Now we're back with me at Avon in 1986-87. It's a big creative department. We've got 6 art directors, 6 copywriters, guys to manage the production of the print pieces, translators, the whole thing. The copywriters, as I mentioned, are using some sort of computer system. I think it was called the Microvax. Maybe that was the manufacturer. I don't know. But they were writing their copy on these machines. And one day, a small Macintosh computer appeared in the creative area and was put on a table.
Now, was there smoke involved?
There could have been. You know, the apes in 2001, when they wake up and the obelisk is there and they all kind of, but that was us. Okay. It was stuck there at the end of our hallway on a table. And we were told by somebody that this was going to revolutionize the way that we worked, that we were going to one day be doing all of our work on this little computer. And I can still remember being unable to grasp how that could possibly be. Sitting there with my markers, again, all that stuff I've mentioned, and nobody's explaining it. And I'm sure I wasn't alone going, what does that mean? How would that be? So that's 1986-87. It took years for that situation to progress because I know that I learned Quark Express. For people who are used to using Windows applications, Quark Express is the page layout application for computers. You'll hear us talk about those like Illustrator and Photoshop. These are the big softwares we use. So The little Macintosh lands at Avon in the creative department in 1987, something, maybe it's 88. By 1992, 4 full years later, we're going to courses to learn Quark Express so we can begin this big digital transition. Still completely mystified because we have no mental furniture, no mental context to imagine how this is going to work out. We still think we produce layouts, we hand them off to a mechanical artist, the mechanical artist produces what was called the mechanical, that went off to the print production department. We ordered typesetting galleys from a typesetter. I'm using industry jargon here. It all went together very manually, and lo and behold, our pieces were printed. Somehow this was going to be replaced by this computer. So they sent us off to courses, like Richard mentioned his courses, somewhere in East End, Montreal, at night, sitting there in front of these little computers, mouse, keyboard, monitor, the whole thing, and they're teaching us about filing and what that means, using a really bad metaphor. I can recall this. Imagine the screen you're looking at is the galaxy, or the universe perhaps, and within the universe there are galaxies, those were the file folders. Then the file folders are documents, those are the planets, or what. Like this was what are you talking about? So there was a lot of that going on, but lo and behold, they showed us Quark Express.
Now imagine, Dave, they could have used a different metaphor instead of galaxies, like let's say a desk, an actual fucking folders.
Imagine, eh? Yeah, imagine, eh? This is a desktop. I still remember the exotic nature of the word document. To me, a document was something that the FBI produced. A document, right? It was like, documents were filed today in the Watergate hearings or whatever. So this was kind of exotic. And we started, and I recall being able to suddenly like typing a headline into a document, 50% off all deodorants or something, and being able to apply typeface to it. Yeah. And that's what began to get to me, because we rendered typefaces by hand. At the typesetting studio I mentioned like some minutes ago, all the way up through Avon, you would render your headlines by hand in the typeface you had chosen. So if you chose Futura Extra Black Condensed, you would draw out your headline in Futura Extra Black Condensed. Body copy, you just do it with like straight lines. You'd indicate body copy. I became very good at rendering a handful of fonts.
But then they would have been recreated.
How do you mean?
Well, if you rendered them by hand, they weren't shot that way. And
No. They were just for the layout.
They were for the layout.
It indicated you could fit the words into a certain area. Okay. It had to be reasonably accurate. The typesetting house I worked for, coming out of school, Typecraft, was Montreal's sort of advertising agency's high-end type house. Tony, the owner, used to actually design typefaces in the UK. I watched that guy with black ink draw ligatures on type that we had set for like a cheese campaign for Vickers and Benson again. And it was like perfect. Whoosh. And he'd join an S to a C. Yeah. And then he'd give it to me to clean up. Tony's favorite thing would be to stand over my desk while I was working, smoking a cigarette, and go, quietly, "You're doing something wrong." Of course, I didn't think I was doing anything wrong. He'd say, "I'll be back in 10 minutes so you can show me what you're doing wrong." And he'd walk away and I'd be like, "I'm fucked because I don't think I'm doing anything wrong." I have to evaluate everything I'm doing. But it was a good learning experience. They closed me in the place one night overnight. I had to do like a sock catalog, mechanicals for a sock catalog for Fila or something. It came in late in the day. The art director would typically show up and there's all this discussion going on. And Tony comes to me and says, the mechanicals for that catalog need to be completed by tomorrow morning. I said, "Gee, Tony, because the place will be open till 8 or 9 o'clock at night. There was kind of a slight evening shift for the typesetters, and then they'd lock down." I said, "I don't think I can finish this. It's like 16 boards. I don't think I can make it." He goes, "We're going to basically close you in here overnight."
Even if you want to go home, you can't.
So we're going to give you some food, whatever it was. And there's a blanket in my office if you need to take a nap, but you kind of need to get it finished. So they locked me in overnight. I remember like having the window, it was in the summer, having the window open and like sort of looking out on St. Catherine Street, smoking cigarettes and dropping them onto the sidewalk, because I did that in those days.
Yeah.
And I got it done.
Okay.
And Tony comes in the morning and I'm like a hero, right? Like I've got it done. And I'm thinking I can't wait to go home and take a shower sort of thing. So he comes in and he goes, "So how did it go?" As I said, "It's done. All the boards are piled up on the product." He goes, "That's great." And I'm thinking he's going to say, "You know what? You saved the company. Take a well-deserved rest," right?
Yeah.
No, he gives me my next assignment.
I thought he was going to say, but you did it all wrong.
No, nothing. No, just, okay, so we got something from Jerry Larange here. Needed to go over this. And I was like, huh? So,
Tony, I haven't slept.
Tony, I haven't slept. I haven't washed. I don't think I shaved much in the day.
I smell like ink.
Yeah, I smell like ink. Yeah, I smell like Pong. So working the whole day, and that was it. I called my parents and saying, "Oh, I think I'll be home tonight. I'm not sure." This whole sock thing going on. Anyways, that's not digital. I just thought it was worth throwing into the podcast for posterity. So learn Quark Express with my colleagues as we learned it became apparent what the power of this thing was. I was always a type fanatic anyway. I love my typography. And when I discovered I could kern, K-E-R-N, and for those not in our industry, that means to adjust the spacing between specific pairs of letters so you get the proper appearance. This is only done for large size like display type and a headline. Don't do it for body copy. But there are reasons why you need to adjust the spacing between pairs of letters to achieve an optimal appearance. I was like in heaven. I was like, I can kern my own headlines. Couldn't believe it.
Kerns, and then for like bunches of text, you could do tracking.
Tracking and kerning.
You couldn't do manually, which is very hard to do manually.
That's right.
And you can say, oh, I this whole column is like half a line too long.
Yes.
Select the whole column and just track it a tiny bit.
Yes.
And whoop, that line would pull back up
Does that
without
feel good?
affecting the look of it too much.
I feel good. There we were. So this almost immediately put out of business typesetting houses. Kind of never realized it at the time because we're kind of dense and weird thinking, but there were entire companies devoted to setting type based on our markups of the copywriter's copy. And they would send back these type galleys, and then those would be glued into place, pasted into place by the mechanical artist. Gone. Color separation houses were gone. The making of films in the old-fashioned way, all that was replaced.
Replaced by service bureaus.
The service bureaus.
Yeah, I worked at one
there
of them.
The parole goes back to Richard now. I'm at 1992, so there we go.
Yes, I worked briefly at a service bureau, and you had these would pop up, and they would have replaced your type houses. So the service bureau, you would send them your files either on a disk, on a SyQuest, any type of removable media, or in some cases, if you were fancy, you could send it electronically, because at that point, we had dial-up modems, and some places would have had faster lines, and you could actually transmit electronically.
So not email yet, but something else.
Email would have been around, yes. You wouldn't necessarily email your files because they were too big. But if they were fancy, and they might have had an FTP site, and then you could drop your stuff into the FTP site.
Right,
but most of the time, SyQuest.
FTP is File Transfer Protocol.
Yeah.
It's a website that's used for just moving big files back and forth between two people.
So back then, things didn't fit on floppy, so everybody had the SyQuest, which was a form of removable drive, square plastic thing. It looks like a big CD on the inside, a thicker CD.
Yeah.
They were fragile. If you dropped them, you'd screw them up. We would receive the jobs at the service bureau, and the service bureau would take your files off the SyQuest, open them up in whatever software, and then send them to print. And to print would be to send to either make films or to make plates, but most of the times it was to make films. So you would send it to the image setter, which was basically a printer that prints on film, and then the films would get developed as if you were developing negatives.
Chemistry still?
Chemistry still would come out, and then you'd get your negatives, and your negatives would then still have to be stripped up, possibly if you're doing separation. And stripping up
Yeah, lots of jargon here, people, but
as opposed to stripping down, which is a different thing. You would take your films and you would set them up your different color
on goldenrod.
On goldenrod, exactly, which is still the name of that color today.
Is it?
You can order goldenrod paper, like we have. It's like a sort of an orangey kind of paper.
It's an orange plasticized paper.
At the hospital, when for the print shop, when I'd order paper, it's called goldenrod because it is that color. And you would lay your films one on top of the other to make sure everything was in register, and you had your registration pins. You remember those? Your registration pins,
of course, yeah.
And then from that, they would burn the separate plates. But before you did that, you had to make sure that everything was in register. So when they printed, your colors were all perfectly one on top of the other, and you had no little white gaps, which needed to be trapped. But that was a whole other thing. Yeah, your films. Yeah, you would have to go in and with the opaque. What was that called? It was reddish.
It was reddish. It was an iron-based ink, right?
Yeah.
That made it opaque. What was it called? I can't. It'll come to me at some point, or you, right? At some point.
I don't remember if we just used to call it opaque. We get the opaque, or something.
So we're describing, listeners, an industry in rapid transition from markers and paper in 1982-83 to computers and a much simplified production process by 1993. It completely changed the way we worked.
And so
the way I worked, it was gone.
Absolutely.
Gone.
And at the service bureau, we would receive the files, and you'd open them up, and you'd go to print, and sometimes they'd forget to include the fonts, and you'd have to call them up.
Remember that?
Yeah. Fonts. Yeah. And fonts, they had licenses back then, so it's not like you had every copy of the font, wink, wink, but often you would have to ask the client to supply you the font, and then you were supposed to destroy it after. You weren't supposed to keep it because there was very, very proprietary licenses.
What a lot of bullshit that
was.
When you think about it.
Yeah.
But clearly people were protecting turf, and I understand why that would be now at the age I'm at. Why? Because, entire industries were dissolving before their eyes, It must be said that when we transitioned to Quark Express at Avon, not everybody had an easy time of it. There was a couple of older employees that really had trouble with the new workflow. One, in fact, had to leave the company. I won't mention names, but just couldn't adapt. They took him out of his office and assigned me to teach him to use Quark Express. I couldn't do it.
Is he a monk now?
He might be, yeah. And another one who, he could get the work done, but Richard will know what I'm saying. I used to look at his stuff and I would turn on the invisibles, right? And I would see a mess.
Oh, yeah.
And I was always very disciplined about putting my documents together. I tried, in fact, to make as few bounding boxes as possible. My goal, and it was just personal discipline, was at the end of the day to have as few boxes as possible to construct my document. This guy, loved the guy, was a great guy. I would look at it and go, oh my God, it's like insanity. It looked like a Salvador Dali surrealistic masterpiece inside. And I remember saying, you're making this so much harder on yourself than it needs to be. You have style sheets, right? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't use style sheets. And I'd say, this gentleman's name, I'd say, man, you're making it like 8 times harder than it needs to be. Let me show you how to make it easier. And learn a few keyboard commands. Never adapted. And I think he retired a year or two later. So it had an impact on people.
If you compare the two, PageMaker and Quark Express, a very different way of working. Quark Express introduced us to boxes, where you had to create a box before you could put content. So you would create a text box and then you would import content into it, or text. You would create a picture box and then you would import a photo into it. PageMaker was very much the electronic version of PasteUp, because you could just click and start typing. You didn't have to create a box, right?
I didn't know that.
So you could copy some text and then just click and drag, and you would create the box in the size that you dragged. And that was it. The text was there.
You work with it a lot or just a little?
I loved PageMaker.
Okay.
The thing is, by the time I left school and started working at a toy company, Quark Express was dominant already. They had just basically killed PageMaker. PageMaker was much older. PageMaker was older than Quark Express. It would have been a lot easier to learn if you were used to the world of PasteUp, because it essentially worked like PasteUp. You just dropped anything on the page, you can move them around, you can do whatever. Imagine in PasteUp, if I told you, Dave, you're going to stick this column that you've created down, but first you have to create a box on your page and then put your column in. It made no sense. Why am I creating a box? I have my content. Yeah. And whereas PageMaker was just like, text, I've copied my text, paste and drag, paste and drag.
Yeah.
And so you have people who had learned that way. And so if you looked at their layouts, they were PasteUp layouts as opposed to digital layouts.
Sure.
And that's where you got that sort of feel. Quark was a giant pig. It just was one of the most unstable pieces of software I've ever used in my life.
I don't recall that. I'll be honest with you.
When I ended up working at a toy company in 94, we were only 2. It was me and my friend. We did all the layouts, and we had 2 artists plus an art director. So the artists would actually sketch out toys and little figurines and stuff by hand. And the art director would come up with the concepts, hand them off to us on mechanicals, and then we would interpret them. And my boss at the time would create the instruction.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Instruction sheet.
Right.
And at one point when the studio got bigger, we were 4 or 5, maybe 6 graphic artists creating the stuff, and Quark would constantly crash and wipe out all your work. You had to learn to constantly save. And sometimes Quark would crash during a save and completely nuke your file.
Ew.
I remember my first wife at the time, we were living together, we were going to school together, and she was working on this document in Quark, big 150-page catalog of some of their services or whatever. The night before, she hits save, and Quark completely fucks her file. Completely.
No way.
Can't recover. The backup is too old because, we didn't do a save as or whatever.
Yeah.
And I spent the entire night, didn't sleep, spent the entire night rebuilding the file from scratch, that in the morning, she went to bed. She was crying, went to bed.
See, that's a good husband.
Rebuilt the entire file. She got up in the morning and believe it, I had to go to work the next day.
Yeah.
Handed her the document. I said, hey, here we go. I did the file. But after that, pissed me off so much, I went to work and I converted everybody to PageMaker. So I bought copies of PageMaker.
See,
and I tried to, but my boss refused to use PageMaker.
Really?
And then InDesign came out, and behind my boss's back,
which replaced Quark Express as the popular choice of page layout software.
Slowly, because
but for the people listening in who don't know, it eventually took over.
So they kept PageMaker around. They developed InDesign, and when they shipped it, and I've been following this for a long time, and the day they shipped it, I bought 5 copies without telling my boss. And so it came in and he goes, "What the hell is this?" I'm like, "This is the future right here. This is going to replace everything we're using."
InDesign is the future.
InDesign,
which is the Adobe product for people who would know of Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. It's the Adobe be proud of.
And it was the biggest pig you've ever seen in your life. This thing could barely run. Version 1 was unbelievably terrible.
Really?
It required so many resources. It was a pig. And by version 1.1, it was able to breathe a little bit, and it really picked up from there. We never looked back.
Yeah, that's been a real evolution. Let me dial it back a bit to the first time we encountered email and the internet. So I'll give you my origin story there. Again, I'm at Avon because I was there during those years. I had become a department manager. I was working on the microvac system in my office. I didn't have much to write, but I would do memos and things and print them out, and my secretary would take them to the mailroom, all that stuff going on. One day, we were invited by the technology department to the main conference room for a presentation. This would happen on a regular basis. They were there to show us, and again, when I look back on this, I think that part of the problem was that nobody knew how to communicate properly what was going to happen to our workflow. They brought us there to show us Lotus Notes. I don't recall that anybody said, there's a new technology coming. It's called email. This is what it is. We've chosen Lotus Notes as the email program. Which is, here's Lotus Notes. I recall looking at it on the screen, back and forth. We're a bunch of young guys. We're in our late 20s, kind of listening, and this is what you'll be able to do back and forth. We kind of went, why would we do that? So we're going to be writing little electronic notes back and forth between our offices? Didn't make any sense, because I had this perfectly good workflow where I would print a memo, give it to Lori, whatever.
You're like, Lotus is going to kill Lori.
What does it mean?
Yeah.
And I guess we simultaneously got the internet, as we would have said in those days.
Yeah.
And maybe by now I've got like a PC or something on my desktop, or probably they give us all Macs because we were in the creative department. In fact, they did. Yeah. It was a Mac. I didn't need it, but anybody in the creative department got a Mac. And I had Quark Express still and all that, blah, blah, blah. So the internet was a thing. What was the internet? Didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know where to go. I recall some guys from CompuServe coming into Avon. I told you the story the other day, right? So they come in.
I think people need to hear this story.
So they come in, and Avon produces this enormous catalog 18 times. In fact, we were the largest purchaser of paper in Canada for years, maybe still are. 18 times a year, the company produces like 1.5 million copies of a 150-page catalog. That's a lot of paper. So paper companies are very interested in us. And these guys from CompuServe came into Avon, and I was one of a small group of guys chosen to listen to this presentation. And we're in this conference room. I can see it to this day. And these guys are saying, guys, there's a new technology coming. It's going to, we're always hearing that in those days. It's going to completely revolutionize the way you work. And there was like a little TV screen there. And the guys had, I guess, scanned pages from our brochure, and were showing us our Avon brochure on a TV screen. And you could flip through the pages. And the guy's saying, imagine that you could do that, and people could look at the
catalog from home.
And we're like, so we're going to be at home watching TV, but instead of watching Cheers, we're watching the Avon catalog? What doesn't make any sense?
How are you supposed to take that to the bathroom?
Well, exactly. The meeting adjourns, and we kind of went, yeah, let's go to lunch. And we went to Shea Better or something.
Oh, yeah. Or, good sausages.
Good sausages, right? And probably forgot the whole thing. Yeah. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law had given us an old PC. I had no intention of buying one. I still didn't really know what I could do with one. So I get this PC, had a tape backup.
Oh, yeah.
So I set it up downstairs in the basement, and it's got Windows 3.1. And we're both out. We like to learn stuff, right? So I whip out the chapters. I buy a book on Windows 3.1. I buy a book on computers for dummies, right? What's a motherboard? What is read-only memory? What's random access memory? All that stuff. And I've got it there, but I can't really do anything with it, because I don't really have anything to do with it. And we decide we'll get the internet at home. So we sign up with Videotron. We had one phone jack on the main floor, and it's in the kitchen. And across the kitchen, down the stairs to the playroom, basement, whatever, on the other side is where the computer is. So I have to go to Radio Shack and buy like a 30-foot cable with the little clip on the end. What's it called?
RJ45.
RJ45. And at night, when nobody was using the phone, I would have to clip in the cable and then run this, unfurl this 30 feet of cable down to the basement and plug in the computer so I could look on the internet and do nothing. That was my introduction to the internet. I remember learning to write a little bit of HTML, basic stuff, producing a document, and then opening that document with my browser and having a sudden revelation. That's what a browser is. And all these things began to grow into our lives, browsers and email programs. And I can recall talking with the technology guy at Avon at that point, Pierre, him saying, exciting news, we're getting a 1 gigabyte server for the creative department. I'm quite sure that's what he said. I keep a 256 gigabyte stick in my briefcase for emergencies, 1 gig for the whole creative department. But here was technology slowly building around us. Then we were using different storage media, burning CDs, all this stuff, and the markers were forgotten, and the layout pads were put aside, and never did they come out again. And we were into that era of the internet.
Just a correction: RJ45 ends on an Ethernet cable.
Oh, for God's sake,
phones,
Richard.
It's an RJ11.
Now people are going to go out and buy the wrong connector. Not going to understand my story. It's ruined.
It's an RJ11.
RJ11, of course. Yeah. I have no idea. That clippy thing.
I was saying RJ45 and I'm like, no, that's Ethernet. I'm sure it's wrong. And I couldn't remember the name if it was RJ9 or 11 because the phone uses both.
I'm telling somebody about this. I don't know who.
Okay.
So your email internet introduction, where do you remember it? Was it,
I'm trying to remember first email. So for my first email, I'm thinking it's on my Mac. And for some reason, I'm thinking the first email account I ever had was through a BBS. A bulletin board system, which were around back then before the internet itself took off really big. You have these bulletin board systems, which are the equivalent of a forum today, or maybe if you're using Mastodon, it would be like an instance of Mastodon.
I'd heard of them, but never saw one.
Yeah.
I remember people talking about BBSs.
Yeah. So BBSs, people would set these things up and you would dial in using your phone line and your modem into the BBS, and then you'd have this little interface. We had an account at the Montreal Mirror, which I don't think is around anymore. And so they had a free, you could sign up for free with them, and they would give you an email address. So Richard Bonomo at montrealmirror.something or other. It might have even been more convoluted than that before they simplified the addresses. And so you would have an account there, and I could send an email to my brother who lived in the bedroom next to me. Who the hell else was I going to email? Yeah. But it was so cool to have access to this. We would see this on the Mac on the little 9-inch screen, and we'd look. You had your little categories, so you could look at the latest hits, right? It might give you the Billboard Top 40 listing and this kind of stuff. And I remember at one point in France, they had Minitel. In France, which every phone, at some point, they decided to really push the internet to everybody. So you had a terminal. So they give you a phone, and they'd give you this little terminal. Bell tried to do the same thing with the Alex. It was a little terminal that you would plug in, and you would get it was very text-based, and you could get like your horoscope and the weather and stuff like that. And so for fun, my brother had his little Alex terminal, and I had my Mac, and through the modem, I was able to send him messages. And so I could type in, and we would direct connect, and I could send him a message. But for some reason, when we were using the software, he could type, but he couldn't see what he was typing on his screen. But he would send it to me, and then I would respond back to him. Anyways,
I understand, though.
It was a failed attempt to try to bring the thing that France was pushing there. It was based on the same technology called the Alex.
I can remember the name, and I would have been unable to give you one word of information, just the Bell Alex stuck in my head.
So that would have been my first exposure to email. It was I didn't really send much, and I wouldn't have had email till later. And I'm trying to think of the name of the provider we had back then, and it was somewhat popular. Anyways, and at some point you get like an email address that was tied to that provider, right? This is before the days of Gmail, where it doesn't matter who you're with. Yeah,
web-based email,
Exactly.
Well, I had a Videotron email address, and Videotron's a big ISP. Videotron still supplies my internet here and my mobile phone service, but I actually had a Videotron email account, which I used briefly until I guess I began using my Avon email, and then I went to Gmail. I don't even remember when, but that's it.
And I still remember signing up for CompuServe at one point, and it was expensive at the time. I'm thinking $75 a month. I don't know.
And it was an ISP?
Yeah, CompuServe was one of the biggest. They were like AOL. Before AOL, there was CompuServe.
Oh, I see.
They were gigantic. And the thing with them is you'd get an email address, but it wasn't your name. It was just a series of numbers.
Oh, really?
It was really weird.
Good for anonymity, I guess. And that's the end of part 1. Next Tuesday, part 2 drops on Semi-Retired. You won't want to miss it.